Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about the Truthear crinacle collaboration known as the Zero Red. And before we begin, I do want to thank Crinacle for sending this one to me. It is very much a surprise. And I do want to apologize in advance. I'm not going to deep dive into the box and show you all the tips and the cable and the cards and everything that's included. I think other people will cover that, and you've probably seen it already. So what I will talk about is, in addition to the red faceplate, which is super attractive, this one does keep the same style nozzle. And for those of you who tried the original Zero, you know that one is on a little bit wider side. You know that if you have your set of personal tips, slipping it over this will be a little bit more challenging. Fitting it into your ear and getting a great seal will be a little bit more challenging because you can't push it in as deep. And all those things that will just take you a couple extra minutes to get this one seated in your ear as you're expecting it to be. So in the box, you do get 3 sets of tips, 2 sets of silicones, so a wide bore, a narrow bore, and a foam tips. And for the same reason about the nozzle, I will say definitely try the foam tips. Sometimes that is a great way to not have to deal with getting the right tip and the right seating. Just put a big foam, you get a nice seal, and that tends to be an easy way to deal with nozzles that are a little bit wider like this one. So we'll begin, and I will kind of start with where Crinacle had talked about this Harman style signature in his video, and he talked about it being a little bit more boomy, being a little bit more shouty, being a little bit more V-shaped. And the Truthear Zero Red is sort of a response, or his version of giving you a Harman that's less boomy, less shouty, and very much less V. And you can call that mature Harman or a refined Harman. I will call it Moar Mids because it very much becomes a mid-centric set, very much in line with the original Oxygen, not the warmer, more V-shaped one that you can get today, but going back to what the original OG Oxygen sounded like. And what people would say, oh yeah, it's got some nice bass presence, it's nice and tight and fast, it's got some treble presence, and it's got a nice technicalities for the treble. The extension is there, everything is there, but both of those are really there to support the mids. And those huge, big, open mids are what set apart Oxygen from almost every other one dynamic driver at the time. And certainly every dynamic driver set that was below its price point at the time. Those huge, open, revealing mids with the bass and treble and support and sounding natural, those are the things that really set Oxygen apart. And welcome to Project Red. It's very much along the same lines as that style sound. Yes, it does have 2 dynamic drivers, and it does do some bass, and it's got a very relaxed treble. But what you notice right away are the big, open, revealing mids. It's sort of unmistakable how the Harman signature has been sort of morphed in a way that is much more mid-centric. And that the Oxygen was very much the first set that came to mind, the way the mids are mid-centric, not necessarily mid-forward, not a heavy pin gain, and we can kind of take a look at what really happened with his change in the signature. So you can actually see the original Oxygen in blue, and we're not going to talk a ton about Oxygen, but you can kind of see the bass level, and of course you've kind of got the one dynamic driver up to somewhere right over there. Oxygen does a nice transition through that. And then right here is, again, where the red was actually changed from the original Zero. So he very much brought down the shout. If you consider the shout there, he pushed this back a little bit. So that's actually, what is that, probably about 3.5 or 3. Brought down the shout, brought down the intensity of 5K and those instruments, the snares and the guitars. So, some of those things that really hit there. And you end up with a sort of a more relaxed Harman. But again, what you hear is this, and not mids pushed in your face right here, sort of the way the original Zero was, but a more relaxed, set back version of upper mids here, consistent mids here, and then this mid bass is sort of dropped to the point where it's not actually obstructing anything in the mids. It's super clean, but still has a presence because you don't have all the brightness out here. It's kind of a tightrope, and we'll talk about this again, but I sort of understand why it took so long to get here. Is this depends on this, and this is brought down to not be shouty, but you still needed to have some mid-bass presence, and you still needed some treble, and everything has to work together and sound right. And yeah, so it was quite a balancing act, and I think he pulled it off quite well. And when you just look at it on paper, it doesn't really strike you as super mid-centric, but in your ear, I think it definitely does. And of course, what was also impressive about the Oxygen was it was a one dynamic driver that sounds like a hybrid. So pulling off a hybrid sound with a hybrid actually makes a little bit more sense, and that's exactly what this one sounds like. So if your primary concern is that big 2D bass, again, I'll sort of refer you back to that really wasn't what happens here. That's not what happened on Oxygen. It certainly has some bass and it has some mid bass, but it's not a big bass set. Call it a refined, mature Harman, but he rolled back the bass a little bit on this set, and it's definitely more generally appealing with that bass level as opposed to a primarily bass focused set. And stick with the OG if that is what you're interested in. But will it boom? And I will say, yeah, on Prodigy Minefields, it definitely has some boom. But what you really notice is that separation like a hybrid. So the upper range is separated from that boom that you're expecting on a one dynamic driver. You do it in two, and it actually does take on that hybrid characteristic. And again, it sort of protects the mids level. It's this recurring theme of the bass and the treble are both there to support the mids, and they tend to be just a hair below the mids. It's this keep the mids as clean as possible, but give you enough to make it sound natural. So you end up with this protect the mids, neutral level. And I would say very much like the Oxygen, it is better on Def Leppard's Drastic Symphonies on acoustic, Def Leppard than it is on the Prodigy. If the Prodigy and R&B and rap and EDM and bigger bass things are your thing, then probably look into the OG. Is it better with that 10 ohm impedance adapter? Maybe. I mean, it gives you a little bass. I thought it kind of cut into the clarity a little bit, but the biggest downside of that is you have to really remember to volume up pretty hard on that one. And he picked 10 ohms, and that was probably a brilliant choice there because it gives you 3 dB of bass, but doesn't require you to keep turning the volume up to a point that you might run out of headroom on your phone. So I think 10 dB was actually a pretty good compromise right there on that one. If you go to 25 or 30 or even 75, you are going to be clicking the volume up quite a bit because it's lowering the treble, and you actually need to get that treble level back into balance, and that's going to take quite a bit of volume. Does it need more mid bass, and is it thin? And again, you can kind of see why people are going to look at the graph and say that because of the dip here and the dip that was in the original one, and Oxygen does this, and it all sounded great. But what you're really depending on is this having a mid-bass presence and hearing that over the relaxed pin again. Bring this down a little bit. This is more audible. It has a bigger presence. Bring the upper treble down. This has more presence. When you get tracks that aren't so heavy here, and I will say that this whole scheme is very track dependent, this is very relaxed and doesn't have a whole lot of level, and it doesn't stand out and cut into the mid-bass presence that you should hear. All that works kind of as it should. And as I said, the only thing that really, if you have a track loaded with treble that's really high energy like EDM, then yeah, it will sound a little bit thinner here. But, generally, this is a very tight balance. And bringing this down just a little bit, bringing this down a little bit just makes this more present, more audible. You're doing a lot more without having to raise this to the point where it cuts into your mids. And that's sort of the magic of what happened here. So yeah, it's a little bit mid-bass light. I would say that Nickelback actually sounds pretty good. I think there's enough mid-bass to pull off Nickelback. Delicate tuning, like I said, just getting more mid-bass through less treble is really what's happening there. And it's music dependent, as I said. So the fit, same tip shredding nozzle. That will prevent a deeper fit on larger tips or smaller ears, like I said. You got to work on this one for a couple minutes, and just remember the bass level is pretty much going to be your fit, so make sure you get the fit as good as it can be, because a bad fit will lose any bass, and it really can't afford to lose any bass through leakage there. So sound, relaxed. You sort of have to also wrap your head around You can call it mature Harman or more refined Harman, but it's actually a relaxed version of Harman. More neutral, more natural style Harman without that shout, without that boom, minus the shout, minus the bass boost compensation for the shout, right? There's no feedback cycle of this is too shouty, so we're going to give it a little more bass. A little more bass, now we need more shout because it's not as detailed. This one doesn't have that because it's more mid-centric, and the bass is sort of sitting over here and the treble is sitting over here. They are not competing with the mids or masking the mids or riding on top of the mids. So we don't have that problem anymore. You end up with more clarity, more focused imaging, more focused mids, and like I said, it's almost a plateau where your mids are here and the bass is sort of off to the side a little bit below, treble in the same way. Raising the volume brings the mids forward, but it doesn't push them into a V. And for those of you who like to play with volume, that's kind of an interesting concept. It's mid-centric, and that's why I don't say it's mid-forward like Harman. It's mid-centric, and it will bring the mids up and kind of make them a little more present, but you're not going to get a big bass boost or a big treble boost in the way that you're sort of expecting from other sets or even some other Harman sets. It pretty much stays mid-centric, even at higher volume, which is actually pretty cool. You don't see that too often. So the bass, I will say this one is less detached. There's no need for that mid-bass bump. The original Zero had a really big bump to cover for that lack of transition. Now it transitions, it has a presence to cover more genres. And like I said, there's enough mid-bass there just from moving the treble down a little bit. You get a more mid-bass presence. It definitely covers more genres because you don't have that big boominess to it. Pushing into bassier tracks, definitely passable, but remember, the neutral level and where this works best is a complement to the mids. And think about Def Leppard acoustic and what was really good on Oxygen. A lot of those acoustic instruments, vocals, female vocals, a lot of those things that were really amazing on Oxygen, also going to be very amazing here. Still has some slam and tight definition, maybe more like a hybrid sound than a subwoofer sound. So Holly Cole's Trio, I can clearly see now. It still sounds full. And like I said, that's another track where you don't have a huge treble presence, so you get a lot of mid-bass presence, and it all works very well. It sounds full, and there's still some air to it. It doesn't have that tight density of mid-bass that you'll get on sort of a boomier set. It still has some air, and it sounds quite nice underneath her voice. It doesn't sound out of place underneath her voice, like I said. So the mids, definitely the star and most noticeable part, like I said, very much a mid-centric set. Lowering both ends brings the mids into focus, open, transparent, exposed, revealing, not in any way forced, right? He actually brought down the levels. It's much more, or a lack of force, as you would get in a normal upper mid focused Harman set. A lot of that stuff has been rolled back into a mid-centric set. Focus more on natural, clear, more detailed, better imaging Harman. And I think he actually succeeded. And he pulled it off. I think the imaging, just pulling the mid-bass back a little bit and getting rid of that pin again sharpness. And, I don't know how many sets I've talked about with Harman where you just push the upper mid just a hair too much and it throws off the stage, throws off the imaging, everything kind of becomes out of balance. And he kind of rebalanced that whole thing. And yeah, it took a long time, but I think he pulled it off. I think there very much is a nice balance of retaining that upper mid energy while removing the shout without over dampening it or even softening it. And a track like Queen's, another one bites the dust. It's very interesting to hear how he pulled back the upper pinna without really softening the sound, without losing that bite that you get with Harman on female vocals. Very, very much a tightrope that he walked to pull it off and to pull off that track while pulling back the pin again, without having to really pull the mid bass down to zero. Yeah, really, really hard how that all works together, but you can hear it on a track like that. So I will say that there's one nitpick to this style is the open mids really does reveal the dynamic driver resolution. So when you're kind of looking at it and saying, well, can this dynamic driver compete with $100 sets, with balanced armature sets? And, it's one thing to say that it's, a little less resolution than balanced armatures, but then when you sort of realize the tuning and how it's so revealing and so open and so big, to get to that point where you're sort of noticing that there's this natural resolution to a dynamic driver, isn't going as far as you can, that's a pretty big thing to say. And I do think it kind of comes across as hybrid text, but DD timbre. And I think it actually is a win. And you can sort of nitpick it and say, well, it's not like a $300 set in resolution, but to get two dynamic drivers to that point where they are so exposed and so revealing and so resolute, man, that's kind of a big trick that he pulled off to do that. And so, yeah, I will nitpick it, but I will also acknowledge that to get to that point was quite a feat. And but do be aware, it's still a dynamic driver, even though it's two dynamic drivers. So treble, I will say it's smooth and relaxed. There's no bright spots. The pinna starts at pinna and it downslopes just to keep the energy consistent. And I think it does that very, very well. Very neutral, and it probably does that better than O2 actually, because O2 had a bright spot in the upper sort of lower treble, and then it's good for female vocals, but not quite as consistent. Very neutral. This one isn't close to a V, so those sparkly bits that you're expecting to pop out are very controlled against the mids. And so I talked about Prodigy Minefields. That one has a bunch of electronic energy things that on a V-shaped set, they really pop out and sound energetic and fun. Not as much on this one. It's very much a controlled, keep the treble in line with the mids, don't ride above them, don't pop out of place. Upper treble, relaxed level, and air really favors a bit more volume too. This is another one where you got to turn it up a little bit to get all the air, but it does preserve the timbre over pushing details or air. Like everything else, it's not pushed. It's a very natural level of treble, nothing out of place, very much in line with the mids. Very much a support system for the mids to keep that timbre right. And I think, again, it kind of pulled off the right balance there. So stage, again, another one, needs a little bit of volume and then it wraps around your head. The downside of this relaxed Harman style, it definitely needs volume to expand the stage, wake up the music. It's got to sound a little more energetic with a little more volume and really sound its best. But if you turn it up until it projects beyond your ears and over your head, as soon as you hear those vocals rise above your head, you're pretty much welcome to the red zone. That's about where it should be, and that's where it sounds its best. And very much a really nice staging, imaging set once you get it to that point. A little bit below, and it sounds a little bit in your head, but turning the dial helps on pretty much everything here, so do that. So thank you again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.